Welcome to the Sport Employability Podcast, a resource designed to support sports management scholars by sharing ideas, practice and research in the development and promotion of student employability within the discipline. This episode will see Hannah Turner and Joel Cox, Senior Research Assistants on the Erasmus Plus Developing Sports Managers and Leaders Across Europe project, explore virtual group collaboration enterprise projects with Stephen Osborne, Principal Lecturer in Sports Management at Cardiff Metropolitan University and the project lead for the Erasmus Plus Developing Sports Managers and Leaders Across Europe project.
Can you just briefly explain the principles of enterprise and entrepreneurship and then go on and outline some of the aims of the virtual enterprise spaces?
Okay. I think the first thing to be said about this particular module was it's about sports enterprise and entrepreneurship. I think the industry at a local level in the UK and a global level are really advocating this idea of we need to be more enterprising, we need to be more entrepreneurial, our students need to be more entrepreneurial. But there's maybe a lack of understanding or awareness of maybe the wider discipline of enterprise and entrepreneurship education. So in designing the module, we sort of started there. What was the best advice available to us, and what existing networks, theoretical frameworks were available to try and tease out these different definitions of what we mean. So my go-to was the Quality Assurance Agency's publication in 2018 around enterprise and entrepreneurship education, chaired by a former colleague of mine, Professor Andy Penaluna. Andy's been a brilliant advocate for enterprise and entrepreneurship for such a long time that it was natural to drift towards that guidance and to use that as a start point. So for me, it was separating out what we mean by enterprise education versus entrepreneurship education. And I think sport in general, sports management academics, the sports industry really needs to be clear about this language because we've seen lots of publications with this terminology in it, but it might be confusing, particularly for the students if we haven't disentangled it. So for me, enterprise education was about the generation and the application of ideas, often when you set them practical problems, but this is about developing skills and awareness of that idea generation process, and things like innovation, creativity, and developing those skills are part of that. As opposed to then maybe entrepreneurship education, which was about using all of those skills, but in a way that leads towards some sort of value and or venture creation. So it's about, that might be a module that is far more focused on startups or social enterprise startups or B Corps. That's not what I wanted to do with this module. It was more about developing confidence and disentangling what we mean. So I didn't want the students to think that they were coming to our module and going to start a business at the end of it. I wanted them to start the process of being confident to build a business in the long term. But actually those skills of innovation, creativity, problem solving, all part of the entrepreneur, the intrapreneur, every manager's toolkit. So that was the focus of getting the terminology right and the underlying principles of, is this an enterprise education module or an entrepreneurship education module? And definitely the former. In terms of the virtual enterprise element, actually that was, again, in response to looking up and out at the industry, looking at what the requirements were in professional standards in the UK and through the charter body for management of sport and physical activity, SIMSPA, and what their requirements were, expecting, what the employers need and want when it comes to certain skills, and that idea of working in teams and collaboration was very much part of those themes. Beyond that sort of professional standards, we've looked broader into the academic literature and working with colleagues that have just finished an Erasmus project, the New Age of Sports Management Education in Europe, NASME. They did a huge piece of work looking at management competencies, but from the researcher's perspective, and one of the sort of key findings and recommendations was about facilitating more group work for students, and we tend to shy away from it. I wanted to introduce that but go into it knowing that there would be lots of problems. How can I keep those groups connected and present, working with each other over a 12-week program? So it naturally led me towards sort of how can I use the digital environment to enhance what we do in the physical environment to keep them connected. And that led me to using the platform that we used, which was a former graduate of the university that had set up this virtual enterprise platform. But you could use any platform to do that. It was about having a collaborative project space, and the platform was just there. We could use it, and we could frame the projects, and we could get them in group spaces, and the academic could also access that group space. But it was fundamentally about developing the skills that we see in the sector wants, particularly being able to work collectively in teams to produce work.
Okay, yeah, I think that gives us a bit of an outline of virtual enterprise spaces. And you did start to touch on some of the background that led to that, but maybe you could go into a bit more detail, especially highlighting like the importance between the conceptual understanding and then the actual applied application.
What's really interesting with enterprise and entrepreneurship thinking is the application and understanding and almost demystifying the notion of what entrepreneurship is for our students. I felt it's that balance. We often talk in this enterprise entrepreneurship space about what are we trying to achieve in the modules that we're delivering, and there's often three elements that people outline. So it's that knowledge acquisition, so learning about enterprise and entrepreneurship, and then a more practical approach such as learning how to become more enterprising and entrepreneurial, and then so that's learning for enterprise and entrepreneurship, and then learning through by doing lots of practical applications, often the business startup process and so on. For me, I wanted to balance this with learning about and learning for enterprise entrepreneurship, and they often go hand in hand. And particularly with sort of second year bachelor students, this was about building confidence, but also sort of unpicking what they might think about enterprise and entrepreneurship. Was it the sort of stereotypical entrepreneur and they didn't want to set up businesses and they're going to make a lot of money, balanced with maybe entrepreneurship can be more social and more philanthropic. And then there's the process of, and so the creative process, the design thinking process. So in terms of what we were trying to achieve, it was that we had to give them, but to challenge maybe their thinking on what an entrepreneurship and enterprise is. We can't assume that they know that. So that knowledge acquisition had to be there as a fundamental, but quickly then use those ideas in a more practical way around the sort of macro problem that we set them to solve as part of their assessments. I was able to do that with some continuity in the timetabling. So we are able to deliver this module and we'll continue to deliver this module in a single day. So all the weekly program isn't sequenced out, so lecture, seminar over a number of days. Actually safeguard the day, and the students can sort of access this module with no other distractions, no other modules running on the same day. So we almost are then able to run it as a mini incubator accelerator style experience. So they have a lecture, we do some knowledge acquisition very early in the morning, so we've got a clear theme for the day and the week, and then over the course of the day we then build in seminar activities. We give them space to go and work as a group. We also then bring in extracurricular support and provision. So we use our Centre for Entrepreneurship who work with us on the theme, and they may bring in additional guest speakers or do additional tasks that sit outside the curriculum time, but all linked to the theme of that day. So it feels like a mini, almost this sort of mini conference each week for the students. So they're very immersed in it. Because I've got the continuity of the day, I can then do lots of other things with them. So we've taken them off campus and we've done a very short, sharp problem-solving task with an outside employer. So we've taken the ideas and the theory of developing and solving problems for ourselves and our projects, and then we've gone into an industry setting for the day because I've got the time to do it, and we've done this sort of mini hackathon where the employer will set the problem at the start of the day and frame it, and then the students will spend the rest of the day on site, having had all the information, oriented themselves around the business and solving problems, and then feedback at the end. So it's that we don't do that straight away. We do that maybe 8 weeks into the program, because the knowledge acquisition of the problem-solving processes and the underlying principles to that have to be grounded with the students. So yeah, it's that balance of knowing about the topic, understanding the principles, and then once that knowledge is there, being able to apply it. But what I try and do is not do it in this didactic, sit in a lecture theatre today and then do nothing for 3 days and come back. No, not everybody likes that. People like the sequencing and the gap in sequencing, but I quite like to immerse the students in the theme, give them the foundations, and then immediately take them on the journey with that theme by having a day to do it.
Could you outline the 4-step progression model and explain how virtual enterprise spaces encourage the first 2 steps?
Yeah, it's an interesting model. Outside the sports management discipline, there are a number of key authors. I mentioned my former colleague, Professor Andy Penluna. But the 4-step progression model is often attributed to Lukakus and the colleagues that he works with. And really, I've touched on some of the themes already, but it's this idea of building confidence. The 4-step model is broken down into really this enterprise education first and entrepreneurship education second. And then those 4 components then are about the idea generation process in the first stages, and then knowing how to operationalize the idea. So do I understand the process of scanning for opportunities, and I suppose having those creative discussions about solutions, shortlisting and finalizing what our solution might be around our target audience and our users, and then go through that almost that design thinking process. And there's lots of different models of that. We tend to use a simple double diamond model that takes them through the process of idea generation, but by putting the end user that we're trying to design for at the center, and getting them comfortable with that. But I think that part of the process is interesting, and you can often get quite a lot of excitement and interest in coming up with hundreds of ideas, post-it notes all over the room, then being able to get them to start thinking about how they can refine that down by understanding how do we then move on to the next stages and create that value. And operationalizing an idea is a very different challenge to coming up with an idea. So those first 2 stages sort of give them the building blocks. So often people think that they're not creative, but actually with a bit of facilitation and an understanding of the creative process and the types of techniques that you can use, then we see students quite readily come up with ideas and surprise themselves. So we've used things, obviously we do this sort of idea showering and forced comparisons, but we even use things like Lego Serious Play. And it's a funny room when you put a pile of Lego in the middle of the desk and ask a student to be ready to do some tasks, and they're looking at you going, wow, what are we going to do with this? But then taking them through, and they quite quickly get the principles of Lego Serious Play, which is about using the Lego to build the metaphors of the product. So who is your customer, or what would your product look like, and using the Lego to play and to do something hands-on and tangible with it. And I think they surprise themselves at how creative they can be. Then they get down to the technical aspects of shortlisting the ideas, and then being able to sit with the idea and go, okay, so how do we bring this to life? And how can we create? We know this is a potential solution for our end users. We think it might work. But what are the next stages of components to bring that to life? And we're not even talking then about building an organization around the idea. We're just saying, what are the fundamental components of being able to produce it, market it, what partners do we need, what resources do we need, and getting the students engaged in those decision making, and I think in the compromises they might have to make. That process of wrestling with ideas and the operational elements to bring the idea to life is a really fantastic process, and you can see the students then wrestling with the decision making, and that's really what a module like this should be doing. So I like it as a framework because at a curricular level you can then think about what are we doing at first year bachelors, what are we doing at second year bachelors, what are we doing in the final year bachelors, and actually the way we've structured the programme at Cardiff Met is that we get people comfortable with the concepts. So the enterprise education phase, the idea and artifact and the value creation is first year, second year, level 4, level 5. And then we give them the option to do an entrepreneurship project in their final year. They can use that idea or they can develop something of their own. But the aim is to build confidence so that they at least see that as an option for their final year project. The other way we facilitate that is that this module then will link to, as a capstone module, to a few other modules in the curriculum. So we take the ideas that they've been working on and then we link that to people development or marketing so they can carry their ideas on in those other modules and they can do related tasks. So they write a marketing plan or they write a human resource management plan of the types of skills and activities they might need or people they might need to deliver. So there's lots of different ways then we can push that on. I suppose the other thing to say with that answer is the sort of underlying pedagogy of thinking about constructivism, in that we're giving them the sort of experience. They're not passively sitting there receiving my lectures, that we're actively engaging them in the enterprise task, the idea generation. So they're not just learning about idea generation, they then do it. And we give them the experience. And we have that sort of macro scaffold, and we use the assessment to give them a focus. So the macro scaffold is often a problem that we give them. And that might be a very simple problem, that we have to design services and increase participation for older adults or younger people. Or we might use the university context and talk about the university services, and we take them into the spaces, or we get them to work with the managers, and we set them a service level problem that they all have. And then we give them quite a broad scope to go and solve that problem. But we use that framework and that scaffold from week 1 right the way through until they present their final assessments. And that helps sort of tie that together and give that lived experience. A meaningful experience. And I suppose the virtual placements then and working online is about bringing maybe a more contemporary learning theory around connectivism into our thinking. And it's really this idea of allowing students to come together using technology environments to plan and collaborate and work on joint projects, which are really key 21st century skills. And we have to think long and hard then about how we facilitate that so that they're not just coming onto campus and doing group work in a physical space. They can carry that work on beyond the campus and into the sort of self-directed learning time by at least facilitating a mechanism where they can all come together and collaborate in a single space and see the product of that collaboration emerge over the number of weeks towards their final assessment. And I think that combination of using the constructivism with connectivism has given us a really rich environment. They seem, over the last few years, to be highly engaged in the process, in their ideas, and we inevitably have problems with group work, but the pass rate is really, really high, and we have worked hard to make sure that we've sort of circumvented some of the issues that arise through group work. But having the virtual environment helps with that, because the academic can see the contribution and who's involved and who's not and the progress that they're making. And I think that alleviates some of the concerns from the students.
So speaking about online collaborative learning, what are some of the positive and some of the negative outcomes of online collaborative learning?
I think group work in general is often difficult for students, particularly where a summative assessment might be linked, and it is in this instance. But what we've tried to do in terms of getting fairness of contribution, which is often the major issue with group work for students, if they're all going to get the same grade, who's contributed the most or the least, and so on. And those are difficult dynamics to unpick. And what we try to do is have in the assessment process some differentiation. So there is a group mark, there's a group contribution and a group output, but the final assessment is also made up of individual components to that, so that the individual student can contribute and self-reflect on the work that they're doing and submit something that's going to get marked independently as part of their overall grade. So I think the group work element can have those dynamics and those tensions of fairness and contribution. And there's a number of guidelines now about how to facilitate group work, and that differentiation is part of it. And we do some peer review, but we don't allow the students to mark each other's contribution, but we do have an insight into people's perceptions of contribution. So the student produces a reflective commentary of themselves, but also peer review, and we mark the quality and the nature of the peer review. So are they able to evaluate their fellow group members, and are they able to give them constructive feedback? And we mark the actual production of the peer review, not use the peer review to mark the other students. So I think there's ways and means of alleviating that fairness and that contribution issue in terms of some of the dynamics, but we don't force group startup. So we don't put them in groups. These are adults. Yes, they're young and emerging adults, but we give them the respect of being able to form the groups with a set of guidelines and principles. And I think by allowing them to construct their own groups, that still can become problems, but they seem to be more comfortable that it's in a group that they are able to work with and people that they know, rather than forcing them in. Inevitably, you do have to piece together groups sometimes, and you have to work hard to scaffold. But I think for the team, the academic team, it's about understanding that there will still be those group dynamics even when they construct their own groups. They're friends, they're peers, but they've never necessarily worked together to produce something. So we understand then the group dynamic process that we have to coach them through. So it is about setting those early principles. It is about using the seminar spaces and activities to facilitate some clear boundaries for the group and working methods and principles, and using the tasks in class to facilitate that group formation process. Getting them set up early online, supporting that early setup in the collaborative space is critical. I think we learned our lesson very early on that if you don't do that quickly, then they can compress and you can't build activities around that. So what we've tended to do in recent years is form the groups very quickly in the first few weeks, get them set up in the collaborative space, whatever you're using, and then start building tasks in class around the collaborative space. So they're all there, they're all present, they can all start contributing, and you can solve problems then with the new system or what might be working, what might be working. So you sort of head off and make sure that they're physically engaged on campus activities and then remotely engaged through the collaborative spaces, but we have to facilitate that. I think once you start solving all these issues and thinking about the group dynamic process, what we tend to find, the positives of it is, because this is often a new area of learning for lots of students, and there's so much to think about when you start developing new ideas and operationalizing them, actually doing that as an individual can be quite daunting. And actually having them in groups allow them to share the struggles of working within new ideas and new theories. So they've almost got these little mini communities of practice that they're developing, and it's strength in numbers. They can lean on each other, and the strongest students often then will be really good at explaining and bringing other students through with them. And you often see at the end of this that the normal distribution of marks is still there in many respects because of the individual aspects of the assessment. But what you do see is an improvement in standards, because you've got students then working with each other, and the students that might not be performing as strongly as others see the standards that the students that are getting to first class honours marks, and they start raising their standards, because it's almost like that vicarious experience. They're observing peers and what they're doing, and then that's having an impact on their own work. So those are the benefits, I think, from working in groups, whether it be in physical groups or online groups. It's just that ability to lean on each other, the ability to wrestle with new concepts together, and then raising standards in general across the group. That group cohesion and those skills and that ability to collaborate, these are 21st century skills, and this is what we're preparing students to do. And is it likely that they're going to have to collaborate in multidisciplinary areas across national borders online? That was always going to happen pre-COVID. COVID's just accelerated the need to have those skill sets. So when COVID hit, actually, we were in a good position because we'd already been delivering this way, and it was a natural shift to push all our students into not just collaborating online, but also delivering their final presentations online. Yeah, I think, all in all, the pros far outweigh the cons, and I think, we sit as an academic team to design out the issues, but still open to ideas. And we continue to use the GIBS and the ASK guidelines to make sure that there's a fair balance of marks, that it's not all on the group mark for the final outcome of the module, and students are far more accepting when they can see that their own personal contribution will be taken into consideration, as well as a group element, and that seems to alleviate some of the stresses and the strains as well.
Do you have any advice for the future use of virtual enterprise spaces and how they could possibly be implemented in other HE institutions?
Working online and collaborating online is become now the norm, and I think COVID has accelerated what was already a trend, why we were already looking at that sort of online work. I think it's pretty crucial now that whatever the platform, that we consider how we construct it, set it up, set the context for the students, think about the dynamics of how they collaborate. So can the platform house the project idea? The platform that we were using was designed as an enterprise innovation style platform. So it had predefined templates for the final presentation, and we could work through those predefined templates every step through class, and it produced the presentation at the end. Now, we can use platforms like Microsoft Teams or Google, but I would say that rather than giving them just a joint shared folder, that you almost have to facilitate and structure the activities and the templates you're going to have them working through. But most collaborative sites like Teams, Microsoft Teams, will have the capability of bringing disparate groups together in a single space. The trick for me, the reason we were using the platform that we were using is because it was structured and templated. So it was very little for them to do wrong. When you're in a more fluid online system like Microsoft Teams, that can evolve quite quickly and get out of control. So I think the role of the academic, whichever platform you're using, is to make sure that they have a space where they can work on a shared end product, a file or a presentation. You may facilitate and scaffold the structure of those templates to keep them on task and make sure they don't deviate too far away from the overall marking scheme and what you're looking for them to do in the summative assessment. I think then the ability to have, and this is where Teams maybe has a really strong advantage, or platforms like Teams, where you can build in the messaging aspects to that in and around. So it's not just the comments on the documents, but actually the chat areas, the project management functions within these sorts of platforms. There's lots out there. We've seen people use Asana and various project management platforms. I think my best advice would be make sure it's structured, make sure the students understand what the end product is going to look like if you're using it for your final summative assessments. Make sure if they are going to evolve what you've got there as an initial template, that they understand how that may contribute to their final assessment or not. And I think getting them started early, so orientating them in what you're looking for, how they can work in these environments, thinking about online collaborative skills and competencies as part of the day-to-day information and lessons that you build in at the front end of the course are pretty crucial. And I think once they feel orientated and you've set those working principles, they've got good digital skills, they've got very good social digital skills, so they can use Twitter and Facebook and WhatsApp and Instagram. That doesn't necessarily mean they know how to use Microsoft Teams or another digital site. So we talk about young people being very digitally literate. I think they're very socially digitally literate. I think we need to think a little bit harder about what type of digital skills that they've got and how they might work. But yeah, never assume that your students have those skills, and you need to facilitate that a little. I think all the other good advice then is about using sort of exemplars and scaffolding and templating helps. If you give them blank sheets of paper and blank folders, then you might not get what you're looking for. I think if you start with a template, then that helps and guides them. The dedicated systems, like the system that we used, will have predetermined templates, and that was great. But that is quite easy to do that separately with other sort of platforms. I think the other general advice, there's having it on a day, having that sort of incubator, accelerator feel to it, and framing it away so it wasn't just a lecture seminar. It felt like they were having quite a dynamic experience, and that was aided by working with the extracurricular Centre for Entrepreneurship, our professional service colleagues, who then supplemented what we were doing with guest speakers and exemplars, so I wasn't eroding academic time, so I could maximise the academic time and then supplement. And voluntarily, students could opt in or out of these additional sessions, but we timetabled them throughout the day, so it felt sort of seamless for the student. That why would I leave? There's a guest speaker coming in, I'm going to have a little listen, and we'd thought about the theme of what we wanted to get across, and we brought people in then, either student entrepreneurs, graduate entrepreneurs, well-established entrepreneurs working with the centre, and to build those stories and give advice. And I feel that giving them that wraparound experience in a day over the 12 weeks with a clear framework kept them really engaged. And that the digital environment just allowed that spillover to naturally happen in between coming to campus. They were working on their projects in between. And because the academics were involved in those spaces, we were just there to monitor. We did have a couple of checkpoints for the assessment through the process, so it sort of encouraged them to finalise some initial ideas and proposals, and then articulate that, which reinforced what they would do next throughout the back end of the course, and supplemented them with doing some work off campus. Sort of the aim was to immerse them in the process, and the online environment just facilitated the work beyond the day that we had them per week.